The Roman legion didn't conquer the world with swords alone. Their greatest weapon was food. But not the way you think. When most imagine Rome's armies, they picture gleaming armor, disciplined ranks, and the clash of steel against barbarian shields. Yet behind the polished image of glory was something far darker, a weapon that could cut deeper than any blade, the legion's food system. This was not a matter of comfort. It was not about feasting, or banquets, or celebrations of victory. No, Rome's soldiers were not fed to be satisfied. They were fed to be controlled. Their rations were not just meals, they were shackles. Every grain of wheat, every sip of sour vinegar, every slice of salted pork carried a hidden cost: obedience, exhaustion, and suffering. Imagine it, a soldier marches 20 miles under the crushing weight of armor, shield, and supplies. He is soaked with sweat, his feet blistered raw from leather sandals grinding against skin. At the end of this torment, does he collapse into rest and a hot meal? No. He kneels beside a heavy stone hand mill, grinding wheat into coarse flour by lamplight, his muscles screaming from labor. This was dinner in the Roman army: labor first, survival second, comfort never. Food was as much a weapon as the gladius. It was food that kept the soldiers marching when everything inside them screamed to stop. It was food that bound them in discipline, because a soldier who disobeyed would feel his stomach gnaw with hunger as punishment. It was food that broke enemies as much as blades, as Roman armies stripped villages bare, leaving nothing but silence and bones behind. But the most terrifying secret? Rome knew hunger could make men into monsters, and they used it deliberately. Commanders rationed supplies not only to feed, but to test loyalty, to crush rebellion, and to harden their legions until they were something less than men and more than machines. This was the hidden truth: the legions were not only fighting their enemies, they were fighting their own stomachs. The battlefield was not just the muddy fields of Gaul or the deserts of the East. It was in the camp, in the grinding of the millstone, in the sour bite of vinegar water, in the emptiness of the belly. Behind the shining eagle standards of Rome marched a quiet army of secrets, a system of survival so disturbing, so relentless, that even the bravest soldiers feared it more than the enemy's spear. And tonight, we're going to open the granaries of history. We're going to peer into the cooking pots of the greatest war machine the world has ever known. And what we'll find isn't triumph or glory, but hunger, rot, punishment, and fear. Because the Roman legion's deadliest secret wasn't how they fought. It was how they ate. When you think of a Roman soldier's meal, you might imagine golden loaves of bread, steaming hot from a camp oven, nourishing the men who built an empire. But the truth is far more brutal. The Roman legionary did not receive bread. He received grain. Not flour. Not dough. Raw, hard kernels of wheat. At the end of a 20-mile march, when his shoulders ached from the crushing weight of his pack and his body screamed for rest, the legionary's day was not done. He had to grind that grain himself, hunched over a heavy hand mill, turning the stone for hours until it broke the wheat into coarse flour. Then, and only then, could he cook. This wasn't a gift from Rome. It was a chain. By handing soldiers raw grain, the Roman system ensured they could never escape the endless cycle of exhaustion. Their energy was drained twice over, first by the march, then by the millstone. What should have been food became a form of labor, a slow grind of body and spirit. And here lies the terrifying genius: grain kept them dependent. A loaf of bread spoils quickly. Cheese rots. Meat decays. But sacks of wheat? They could last for months, hauled on wagons across hostile territory. Grain was cheap, heavy, and unyielding, and it ensured that no soldier could survive without Rome's supply lines. Break the chain of grain, and the legion starved. So, every Roman soldier carried not just weapons of war, but the tools of survival: a millstone, a cooking pot, and sometimes even a small supply of grain strapped to his back. He was not only a warrior, he was his own baker, his own laborer, his own survival machine. And the taste of this bread? It was no feast. After grinding the flour, soldiers mixed it with water and salt, baking rough cakes over open fires or boiling it into a bland porridge. Hard, heavy, barely edible, this was not a meal of glory. It was a meal of survival. Now imagine an entire legion, tens of thousands of men, each one grinding, baking, chewing on the same tasteless paste day after day. This was not fuel for strength alone. It was fuel for obedience. Because hunger is the simplest chain of all. And Rome knew it. By monopolizing grain, Rome didn't just feed its armies, it controlled them. A soldier's loyalty wasn't only to his general or his comrades. It was to the sack of wheat slung across his back. This was the true bread of survival. Not a feast of empire. Not a soldier's reward. But a constant reminder that the stomach, like the sword, could be turned into a weapon. The Roman legion marched on wheat, but hidden inside every grain was Rome's most powerful secret: control. At first glance, a Roman legionary's kit looks like the equipment of any soldier: a shield, a sword, armor, a helmet. But hidden among these instruments of war was an object far stranger, a small, heavy hand mill, called a quern. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't armor. It was a symbol of slavery. Every Roman soldier was forced to carry one. Not because the generals were careless about feeding their men, but because Rome had no intention of making the legion's life easy. After the blistering march, after the digging of trenches, after the labor of building an entire camp from scratch, soldiers were not given bread. They were given raw grain. And so, under the flickering light of the campfire, men who had fought and bled like warriors bent down like slaves, grinding wheat between stone. Their arms strained as the heavy quern turned round and round. The dust of flour coated their hands, their faces, their lungs. What little energy they had left was poured into this endless, monotonous task. It was not an accident. It was Rome's design. Exhaustion was a weapon. By forcing soldiers to grind their own rations, the army broke their will to rebel. A tired soldier does not mutiny. A weary man does not dream of desertion. He sleeps, he eats, and when dawn comes, he marches again. Imagine the sound of it: thousands of soldiers, thousands of stones grinding in the night, a chorus of fatigue echoing across the camp. To an outsider, it might sound like preparation, like efficiency. But to the men turning those stones, it was chains without iron. Even the symbolism was cruel. In Roman society, the mill was the domain of slaves and servants. To grind grain was beneath the dignity of a free citizen. And yet here were Rome's conquerors, reduced to the same drudgery as the slaves they captured. It was humiliation disguised as survival. But Rome's cruelty went deeper still. The very presence of the hand mill in a soldier's pack was a constant burden. Querns were heavy, often weighing several kilograms, yet every man was expected to carry one alongside his weapons, tools, and armor. It slowed the march, it dug into his shoulders, and it reminded him of his place, not just a warrior, but a beast of burden. And when the grain was finally ground, what reward awaited? Not warm bread or hearty meals, but a lump of coarse dough, half-baked on a campfire stone, or boiled into a tasteless porridge. The legionary ate like a slave because Rome wanted him to think like one. This was the genius, and the cruelty, of the Roman system. They didn't just conquer their enemies. They conquered their own men. Every hand mill in every camp was more than a tool. It was a weapon of control. A silent reminder that the Roman soldier, no matter how brave, no matter how skilled, was chained not only to his general, but to the grindstone. Thirst is one of the oldest enemies of any army. A man can march on hunger, but without water, he collapses. The Roman legions knew this well. But here's the truth that few speak of: Roman soldiers rarely drank pure water. Why? Because water was dangerous. Streams carried disease. Wells could be poisoned. Even clear water often turned foul in the heat of the march. One drink could kill more soldiers than a battle. And so the Romans turned to a strange solution, a drink that seemed more punishment than refreshment. They called it pasca. Pasca was simple, water cut with sour wine vinegar. Cheap, sharp, and bitter enough to make a man wince as it slid down his throat. But it had a hidden power. The acid in the vinegar killed bacteria, making the water safe to drink. What tasted like punishment was, in fact, survival. Still, there was something humiliating in it. In Roman society, pasca was the drink of the lowly. It was given to slaves, to peasants, to criminals. No noble would ever be seen touching it. And yet, in the camps of the empire's most feared army, it was the standard ration. Imagine the scene: tens of thousands of hardened soldiers, men who had marched across deserts, stormed fortresses, and slaughtered Rome's enemies, drinking the same bitter swill forced upon the lowest of society. Their throats burned with every swallow, their stomachs soured, their pride broken. The legion didn't drink like conquerors. They drank like slaves. And this was no accident. By feeding pasca to the legions, Rome stripped away illusion. They didn't want their soldiers drunk on fine wine, drunk on pride. They wanted them hardened, grounded, humbled. Pasca was bitter discipline in a cup. It reminded every soldier that he was not a lord or a citizen at a banquet, he was a cog in the war machine. But pasca also carried another, more practical cruelty. It was portable. Vinegar lasted longer than fresh wine. A splash could purify a skin of water taken from a muddy ditch or a bloodied battlefield stream. Soldiers learned to stomach the taste, because to refuse it was to risk dysentery, fever, and death. The bitter drink wasn't just habit, it was life or death. Even Rome's enemies noticed. To them, the legions seemed like machines, marching endlessly, drinking their sour ration without complaint. But inside the ranks, every swallow of pasca was a reminder of the system that controlled them, a system that turned hunger into discipline and thirst into obedience. Perhaps the most haunting detail of all comes from the crucifixions Rome carried out. At executions, victims were sometimes offered the same sour vinegar drink, mockingly, as a final mercy. The legion drank daily what Rome used to taunt the dying. And yet, in that bitterness lay Rome's hidden advantage. It kept men alive when water would have killed them. It hardened their will with every gulp. The empire didn't run on wine. It ran on vinegar. In the ancient world, salt was more than a flavor. It was life itself. And for the Roman legion, it was nothing less than white gold. To modern eyes, salt is ordinary, almost invisible. But to a Roman soldier, every grain was precious. Salt preserved meat, kept grain edible for weeks, and transformed rotting food into something barely tolerable. Without it, armies starved, food spoiled, and discipline withered as quickly as flesh in the sun. That's why salt wasn't just part of the diet, it was part of the pay. Some historians even trace the word salary to salarium, a soldier's allowance for salt. In other words, the very wages of Rome's conquerors were measured in white crystals. Soldiers fought for glory, yes. They fought for coin, yes. But just as often, they fought for salt. It was that important. Now imagine the legion on campaign, tens of thousands of men, weeks from home, trudging across hostile lands. Grain they could carry. Animals they could drive. But salt? Salt had to be secured, guarded, transported in heavy loads that slowed every march. The supply lines that carried it were as vital as the spears in a soldier's hand. Cut those lines, and the entire army began to rot from within. Without salt, meat spoiled in the heat. Wounds festered faster. Even the simple act of drinking water became more dangerous, as soldiers lost vital minerals in sweat with nothing to replace them. Salt was not seasoning, it was survival. And Rome knew how to use that knowledge as power. Commanders rationed salt with precision. They controlled its flow as carefully as they commanded the legions themselves. If a soldier disobeyed, his salt allowance could be cut, turning every meal into a risk, every bite into decay. If a unit faltered, their rations could be withheld, breaking them slowly, silently, through hunger and rot. Even Rome's enemies understood the terror of salt. Armies who dared face the legion sometimes targeted supply lines, not the soldiers themselves. If they could stop the caravans of salt, the great Roman war machine would stumble, starve, and collapse without a single direct battle. And collapse it did. There are accounts of units stranded, their food spoiling in the heat, their animals dying of thirst and rot, men reduced to chewing leather straps or boiling weeds just to replace what salt had once given them. Imagine the terror, not of the enemy's blade, but of the creeping weakness in your own body, the cramps in your muscles, the sweat that could not be replenished. Salt was power. Whoever controlled it, controlled life. Rome marched on discipline, on steel, on order, but always, always on salt. And the terrifying truth is this: the mightiest army in history, the machine that crushed nations, was always one broken salt line away from destruction. The eagle standards of Rome may have gleamed in the sun, but without white crystals, they would have fallen into the dust. We often imagine soldiers as meat-eaters, men tearing into roasted cuts after a long day of battle, feasting like predators who had earned their share of blood and flesh. But in the Roman legion, that was a myth. The truth was far more bitter. Most Roman soldiers rarely touched meat. Their daily life was built on grain, boiled into porridge or baked into hard cakes. That porridge, bland, heavy, and unrelenting, was the true fuel of empire. It filled bellies, kept men moving, but gave little joy. Day after day, mouthful after mouthful, soldiers lived not on feasts, but on monotony. Meat, when it appeared, was not the fresh, juicy prize of victory. More often it was salted pork, goat, or mutton, preserved until it was dry, leathery, and stripped of taste. It had to be boiled for hours just to soften, and even then, it was more punishment than pleasure. Yet to the legionary, it was still a luxury. Because meat meant victory. Fresh cuts were usually eaten only when an enemy was defeated, when supply wagons were captured, or when commanders allowed animals to be slaughtered in celebration. Then, and only then, would the soldiers gather around roasting fires, chewing on something more than porridge. These feasts weren't just meals, they were rituals, rare moments when men were reminded they were conquerors, not just machines. But most days, bones outweighed flesh. Ordinary soldiers went weeks without seeing meat, while their commanders dined on the best cuts. It was a brutal reminder of rank and hierarchy. The legion was equal in its suffering, but never in its reward. Officers feasted while the rank and file scraped their porridge pots. And when the salt lines ran thin, the meat became dangerous. Without proper preservation, flesh rotted fast. Worms, mold, and the stench of decay turned rations into poison. Soldiers learned the hard way that what tasted like strength could kill silently from within. There are stories, whispered, half lost in chronicles, of desperate troops slaughtering pack animals, stripping hides from oxen, even boiling leather straps when no other food remained. In those moments, meat was no gift. It was the last stage of hunger before collapse. The terrifying part is not just what they ate, but what it meant. Rome deliberately built its armies on porridge, not meat, because porridge was dependable, cheap, and humbling. Meat was rare by design. It was a reward, a tool of control, something to be dangled as a prize or withheld as punishment. So forget the image of the Roman soldier as a carnivore of conquest. The reality was darker. The empire's greatest warriors fought not with full stomachs of flesh, but with bellies heavy with porridge, their rare bites of meat soaked in blood, sweat, and victory. Rome didn't march on meat. Rome marched on hunger. In the Roman legion, food was never just food. It was power. It was punishment. It was discipline forged in the stomach. Every soldier depended on Rome's rations. Grain, salt, sour vinegar, without them, the legionary was nothing more than a starving man in armor. And Rome knew it. The commanders wielded food with the same precision they wielded swords. Disobedience was not always punished with lashes, or death, or exile. Sometimes, it was punished with hunger. A legion that failed to obey could have its rations cut. A century that faltered in formation might find its supplies halved. A soldier who broke discipline might be left watching his comrades eat while he gnawed on nothing. This was cruelty with purpose. Hunger gnawed at the belly, drained the body, and weakened the spirit. But it also reminded men of dependence. They weren't free citizens in the field, they were subjects of Rome, bound not by chains, but by empty stomachs. The terrifying truth is that some commanders used this weapon not only to punish but to shape their armies. They believed that underfeeding their men hardened them, made them leaner, faster, more resilient. Starvation wasn't always an accident of war, it was a deliberate tool. Take the stories of forced marches where soldiers were given reduced rations, not because supplies had failed, but because their general wanted to test their endurance. The weak would falter. The strong would survive. Hunger became a filter, separating those who could carry Rome's eagle from those who would collapse in the dust. And when rebellion threatened, the stomach became the first battlefield. A disloyal legion could be starved into submission before a single sword was drawn. There was no need for executions if hunger did the work. But hunger was a double-edged weapon. Sometimes it broke men instead of building them. Entire units cracked under the pressure, too weak to march, too desperate to fight. Chronicles speak of mutinies sparked not by cruelty of the whip, but by the cruelty of the empty pot. Yet Rome preferred this quiet terror to open brutality. Hunger left no scars on the back. Hunger made no martyrs. It was invisible discipline, creeping and constant, gnawing at the body until obedience seemed like the only path to survival. Imagine standing in the camp at night, smelling the faint smoke of cooking fires, hearing your comrades stir their porridge while your pot remained empty. The weight of punishment wasn't in the whip, it was in your stomach, twisting tighter with every passing hour. This was Rome's genius. They didn't need to beat their soldiers into obedience. They simply needed to feed or not feed. And so, in the Roman army, the stomach was never safe. It was a battlefield of its own, where discipline was sharpened, loyalty was tested, and rebellion was starved into silence. Rome conquered nations with steel, but it controlled its soldiers with hunger. A Roman legion on campaign was not just an army. It was a moving city of steel, discipline, and hunger. Tens of thousands of mouths to feed, day after day, mile after mile. Supply lines stretched thin, wagons struggled to keep pace, and granaries could run empty in hostile lands. When that happened, Rome turned to its most terrifying supply system, foraging. On parchment, it sounded practical. Soldiers spread out into the countryside, gathering food, seizing livestock, harvesting grain. But to the people who lived in those lands, it was nothing less than a plague of locusts wearing iron. Imagine it, the ground shaking beneath the boots of thousands of armed men. Doors kicked in. Barns emptied. Fields stripped bare. Chickens, goats, cattle, all taken. Grain poured out of villagers' storerooms into Roman sacks. What could not be carried was burned. The legion left behind not only silence, but starvation. For peasants, the arrival of a Roman army meant ruin. Families starved so that soldiers might march. Children watched their winter stores vanish into the hands of foreigners. Villages that resisted were crushed outright. The legion's survival was built on cruelty, their meals soaked in the suffering of those unlucky enough to live along the army's path. But for the soldiers, this was no triumph. Foraging was brutal work. Men marched out with weapons in hand, not only to seize food, but to fight for it. Hostile locals ambushed patrols, hiding in woods and fields, striking at stragglers. What began as a hunt for bread could end in blood. And the food itself? It was rarely fresh or plentiful. A soldier might return with a half-rotten goat, slaughtered in haste. Others carried sacks of grain crawling with insects. In desperate times, weeds, roots, and wild plants were stripped from the soil, boiled into bitter stews. To live off the land was to gamble between survival and sickness. Yet commanders encouraged it. Foraging reduced the burden on supply lines, allowed armies to march faster, and, most chilling of all, broke the spirit of conquered lands. Hunger was not just felt in the ranks. It was inflicted on the world around them. Historians describe campaigns where entire provinces were left desolate after a Roman army passed through, the earth itself scarred by hunger. To the legion, this was logistics. To the locals, it was annihilation. And still, soldiers paid their price. They were forced to eat what they stole, sometimes raw, sometimes spoiled, often dangerous. Every meal carried the taste of fear. The peasants' hunger mirrored the soldiers' own. Both were trapped in Rome's endless cycle of survival and cruelty. This is the silent war crime of the Roman legion. They fought not only with swords, but with hunger. Their armies left famine in their wake, feeding themselves on the misery of others. For the world Rome conquered, the eagle standards did not just mean war. They meant starvation. Every empire has its enemies. For Rome, they were Gauls, Parthians, Germans, and countless others. But the deadliest killer of the Roman legion wasn't always an enemy with a spear. It was their own food. On campaign, Rome relied on bulk. Wagon trains creaked under the weight of grain sacks, amphorae of salted pork, barrels of dried beans, and kegs of sour vinegar. On parchment, it was the perfect system, non-perishable food, packed in bulk, meant to feed tens of thousands for months. But parchment doesn't sweat. It doesn't march. It doesn't rot. Grain that left Italy fresh often arrived crawling with insects. Weevils bored through kernels until flour turned alive with larvae. Mold spread quickly, a green-gray film that clung to every sack when rain seeped through wagon covers. Salted pork went rancid, the fat turning sour in the heat. Fish pickled in brine spoiled in its jars, releasing a stench that sickened entire camps. And the legionaries had no choice. They ate it. Imagine it, a soldier, starved after a 20-mile march, chewing on bread baked from moldy flour. Another boiling salted pork that stank of rot, the stench carried over the camp as men forced themselves to swallow. They knew it could sicken them. They knew it could kill them. But an empty stomach was worse. The silent toll was devastating. Dysentery ripped through camps, leaving soldiers too weak to lift their shields. Fevers followed, spreading from man to man faster than any barbarian charge. Chronicles whisper that more legions perished from spoiled food than from enemy blades. The hidden killer wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the pot. And the cruelest irony? Rome knew. Commanders wrote instructions on storing grain high above damp earth, covering wagons with tar, salting meat twice over. But in war, perfection was impossible. Marches were long, weather was merciless, and supply lines stretched across continents. Spoilage was not an accident, it was inevitable. So soldiers learned to endure. Some scraped mold from bread and ate the rest. Others drowned rancid meat in vinegar, hoping the acid would mask the taste and kill the sickness. But no trick could stop the slow poison of rot. This was the hidden terror of Rome's war machine, that every meal might be your last, not from an enemy's sword, but from the very food meant to keep you alive. A legion could march undefeated against barbarian tribes, only to collapse days later, broken not by battle but by disease from spoiled rations. To outsiders, Rome seemed unstoppable, iron, discipline, and destiny. But within the camps, every soldier knew the truth. Death often came not with a war cry, but with a cough, a cramp, and a rotting taste still lingering on the tongue. The eagle standards loomed over every battlefield. But behind them marched the most relentless killer of all, spoilage and rot. Long before trumpets sounded or banners were raised, before the first shout of "Proelium, Proelium! Battle, battle," there was food. Not just food for hunger, but food soaked in omen, fear, and fate. In a legionary's camp, the moments before battle were thick with ritual. The soldiers gathered, not only with weapons, but with their spoons and their loaves. The simple loaf of bread, coarse, baked over embers, scorched or cracked, held power beyond its taste. It bound the legion together. It turned individuals into brothers. They believed that eating together, breaking bread in silence, cleansed them. Sharing a loaf sealed their fates as much as marching formation or sharpening swords. The bread was not just ration, it was an altar where loyalty was pledged, courage measured, and omens read. And then there was the ritual of denial. Sometimes, in the cold dawn before combat, bread was withheld. A bad omen, they said. The gods would grow restless. The spirits of the earth would jeer. But more than superstition, this was control. To deny bread was to test the men. Who would remain calm, who would grow desperate, who would mutter curses under his breath? Commanders used this as a cruelty disguised as tradition. If the soldiers sensed that the gods were angry, if the skies looked ominous, withholding bread was the easiest way to enforce unity. Hunger sharpened nerves, shared misery strengthened camaraderie. They believed that the gods watched not only the weapons and banners, but the bellies. In some accounts, before a major battle, soldiers would fast or only eat bread soaked in salt or vinegar. The rancid taste, the bitterness, it was part penance, part preparation. The stomach churning, the bitterness burning their throats, such sensations were all part of the ritual, a prelude to the physical pain to come. Bread, in those moments, became more than sustenance. It was a token of fate. To taste it was to touch victory or doom. To refuse it, or to be refused it, was an omen cast, a statement, the gods are watching. The camp priests, the augurs, the officers, they would circle, observe signs. Maybe certain pieces of bread would crack oddly, or certain loaves would burn during baking. A stray spark in the furnace, a loaf that rose poorly, each could be interpreted as a warning, this battle is cursed. And then bread would be denied, or portions reduced. The legion that marched without bread believed they walked closer to death, but also felt binding in their shared ordeal. For soldiers, sharing a loaf before the clang of battle was a vow. We are one. We suffer together. We will fight together. It was ritual, yes, but also terror. Because if bread could bind them, it could also betray them. An omen ignored, a loaf burned or denied, might mean doom. And that terror was Rome's secret weapon. Not just the eagle, not just the steel, but the loaf, the ration, the sacred making of bread. In the moments before battle, food was no longer about filling bellies. It was about staking souls. Bread before war, not a meal, but a contract with gods. And dare you break it? Hunger. That was Rome's final, cruelest weapon. When supply wagons failed, when rivers flooded or enemy raids cut off the lines, the legion became a shadow of itself. Soldiers were still expected to march, to fight, to conquer, but with nothing in their bellies but despair. Ancient accounts speak of starvation marches, whole cohorts driven to gnaw at bark peeled from trees, to dig up roots from frozen soil, to boil grasses into bitter stews. Pack animals, once sacred to the army's logistics, were slaughtered for meat. And when the animals were gone, soldiers turned to anything they could find, rats, dogs, scraps of leather cut from sandals and boiled until soft enough to chew. The Romans called it duriscia, hardness, endurance. Commanders cloaked it in the language of discipline. Hunger was framed as a test, a purging fire that separated the weak from the strong. To suffer was to prove loyalty. To march starving was to show Rome that the legion was greater than flesh, greater than need. But the reality was terror. A starving legion wasn't invincible. It was broken, hallucinating, stumbling through mud with hollow eyes. Entire campaigns were lost, not to enemy blades, but to empty supply wagons. More than once, Rome's conquests trembled on the edge of collapse because men could no longer lift their shields. And yet, somehow, this fragility became part of the myth. Rome demanded not only blood, but the surrender of hunger itself. To starve was to be Roman. To endure starvation was to become the machine the empire needed. The terrifying truth? The legions were always one failed supply line away from destruction. Their greatness balanced on a knife's edge, iron discipline on one side, gnawing hunger on the other. Rome's legions marched on discipline, iron, and blood, but most of all, they marched on hunger. Their food system was never about comfort. It was about control. Every ration was a chain. Every loaf of bread, a test. It was a weapon that shaped men into machines, and sometimes, into corpses. So when you hear of Rome's unstoppable legions, remember this: their greatest enemy wasn't always the barbarian across the battlefield. Often, it was the emptiness gnawing inside their own stomachs. If this glimpse into the darker truths of history shook you, then you are exactly where you need to be. Tale of History is where the past isn't polished, it's raw, brutal, and alive. Subscribe, join this legion of seekers, and march with us into the shadows of history that others are too afraid to tell. Because the past was never glorious. It was terrifying. And we're here to uncover every disturbing truth.